Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's ParaBoss webinar, where we'll explore all things grazing management for worm control. For those of you who I haven't seen for a while, my name's Megan Rogers, and I'm part of the ParaBoss extension team. And yeah, interestingly, today Fiona's on the other side of the webinar controls and is going to be your presenter today. For those of you who are new to our webinars, ParaBoss is a joint initiative of Australian Wool Innovation, Meat and Livestock Australia, Animal Health Australia and the University of New England. It's very much your one-stop shop of independent advice for all things worms, flies, lice and ticks in sheep, cattle and goats. So before Fiona gets started, a warm welcome to you, Fiona. Being on the presenting side of the webinar, desk or virtual desk, I guess it's great to have you talk to us about a particular area of your special interest and very much technical expertise. So Fiona, for those of you who don't know much about where she's from the New England and has a fairly long history of using grazing management for worm control, particularly with Barber's pole. But I must say she's certainly got some expertise and knowledge for areas outside strict Barber's pole areas, and we'll be talking about all facets of using grazing management for worm control. So Fiona's she's our normal webinar host, and she's pretty experienced in this space, but the level of expertise she has in grazing management is huge. So thanks, Fiona. I'll hand over to you now and I will mute myself.
Thanks, Megan, and welcome everyone. It is nice to be on this side of the screen for a change. And thanks for the intro, Megan. Yes, I've been exposed to grazing management for quite some time. Megan scared me at the beginning when we were chatting before we hopped on to ask how long. So certainly since the early 2000s, I did my honours project with grazing management, interacted into that. So yeah, and I've followed it keenly since, and my husband's very much into grazing management. He lives and breathes it, so we do a lot of on-farm practical work as well. So it is a huge topic, and I'm really mindful of that. And when I put this slide deck together, I've tried as hard as possible to simplify it into 45 minutes for some really good take-home messages for you all, no matter where you live and no matter what your production system is. So we will have a Q&A at the end, and I'll try my best to answer the questions for you. But we'll kick off now and see how we go. So what I'm going to cover today is firstly our important roundworms. Then we're going to look at the roundworm life cycle, because that is really key to how grazing management works. And above all, how we as producers can manipulate it for our own benefit. We're then going to look at what I think of as the targeted stock. So for me, who's the most important to get the best out of our grazing management. And then I'm going to take you through a few examples of how it might work on farm at some different locations. So let's start off with who are our roundworms. No surprises, I am, as Megan said, from a Barber's pole region, but we're also going to focus a little bit on Barber's pole today because it happens to respond very, very well to grazing management for a number of reasons, which we'll go through. So Barber's poleworm, otherwise known as Homunculus contortus, is, as you'll probably know, summer rainfall loving. So it loves warm, moist temperatures, normally in the summer rainfall areas, but we're starting to see emerging populations around different parts of the country that we haven't seen before due to changes in climatic seasons, but also it has been due to movements of a lot of stock, especially post-drought as well for me. So they're a really interesting worm. I've spent most of my career looking at Barber's poleworm. They're a very visible worm. They're, especially the adult females, they're very visible, 20 to 30 mil long. And they're on this side of the screen. You can see the why they get their name. They have the lovely Barber's pole shape through them from the blood that they have in them, because they're a blood-sucking parasite. They're a really prolific egg layer, which is one of the main reasons they cause us so many dramas as producers. They lay up to 10,000 eggs per day. So it's really quite substantial, and they live in the abomasum of the sheep, which is one of their stomachs. So staying with Barber's pole just for a tick here before we go to the other parasites. So that huge amount of eggs that they lay, if we're talking a really low worm egg count of, say, 337 eggs per gram, for argument's sake, that means that one sheep is going to lay 337,000 eggs per head per day onto the pasture. So if you've got quite a big mob sitting in a paddock of, say, 1,000 sheep, we're talking well over 3 million eggs per day are hitting that paddock, which under the right environmental conditions are going to eventually get into be effective third stage larvae going back into the sheep, which is why Barber's pole can cause such huge problems really, really quickly. This is a little video, I think it's come from Matt Playford originally. It's from our website at ParaBoss here, and it shows the lining of the abomasum. Someone's done this on post-mortem, and you can see how active these little Barber's pole worm are in there. They're really easy to see on post-mortem, and there's always lots of them if you've got a problem with them. So our next worm that we're going to talk about a bit today is black scaleworm. So it occurs in all sheep areas of Australia. It's quite hard to see by comparison to Barber's pole. It's only 4 to 7 mil in length, and it lives in a different location. It lives in the first 3 meters of the small intestine, so it causes a lot of damage to the gut lining. And it's nowhere near as prolific in its egg-laying ability as Barber's pole. It lays about 100 to 200 eggs per day, but it still causes us a lot of problems. And the other worm that we're going to touch on today is the brown stomach worm. And it also occurs in most parts of the sheep regions in Australia. It's especially a major parasite in the winter rainfall districts. It really likes and can cope quite well with the cold, dry areas. It's a small red-brown worm. It's only just visible. It's only about 10 mils in length. And just like Barber's pole, it lives in the abomasum of sheep. The adult females lay about 50 to 100 eggs per day. And you probably previously have known it as Ostertagia. It underwent a name change a few years back. So there are 3 main roundworms that we're going to look at today. And even though they're different in the way they act, their life cycle is very similar. So there are 3 stages of the life cycle that we're going to look at today, and we're going to be interested in, because they're the stages that will help us with our grazing management, because it's all about manipulating the life cycle of the worm to try and interrupt it. So the first stage is the host stage. So the sheep in this case will be our host. And then we're going to look at the dung phase, which will be in the actual pellets of the feces, and then moving on to the pasture stage, so onto the actual grass and pasture that the sheep are grazing. So here is a diagram of the life cycle. So you'll see the host stage. When the larvae are inside the host, this is when they're able to live and survive for many months in the host, and as the sheep is our host, and they reproduce and they can lay eggs. Now, these eggs are spelled out in the dung. So they then appear in the dung stage, and eggs can sit in the dung, dependent on species. We're going to go through that for differing periods of time, but under the right environmental conditions, they will start to develop into larvae and go through the stages and eventually get into what we call L3s, which are infective larvae. And they're the ones that can cause trouble for our sheep. So they're the ones that hatch out of our dung pat and wriggle around on the grass, and then they're in the pasture stage. And this is when the sheep come back through and graze the larvae, pick them up, and the whole process starts again. So our job with grazing management is basically to try and interrupt this life cycle at different stages. So what's important to that, and the things that we've got to think about to make sure that our pasture or grazing management can be effective from a worm point of view, is to start to think about the length of time it takes for our eggs to become larvae. So that's once they're in the dung phase, how long it takes them to go through the process of hatching out and becoming effective larvae, under what environmental conditions, which is warmth and temperature, and then moisture, so the amount of rainfall, it takes to get those eggs to actually hatch into larvae, the time that the eggs can survive on the pasture, and then, of course, the time larvae can survive on the pasture. And all of this varies with species, but it also varies with the temperature. And all of these different environmental conditions and biological conditions then determine our rest and graze periods. So we look at all of these to work out how we're going to do our grazing management, and I'm going to talk you through that today. So let's start first with looking at a few of these different aspects. So the first one I want to look at is the time eggs can remain viable on pasture. So once they've come out of the sheep, so they're out of the host phase, they're in the dung phase, and they're sitting on the pasture as eggs. It's very different, as you can see by this table, per species. So the brown stomach worm is the most robust in its egg stage, and it can survive on pasture for 21 days before hatching. Black scale worm, a little less, 16 days. Barber's pole worm is the worst of the lot. If they don't get the right environmental conditions for hatching, they're gone. The egg phase is not very robust for them, which is really interesting. So it gives us a chance to utilize some of these aspects in our grazing management. So we have very robust brown stomach worm and black scale worm in the egg phase. Barber's pole doesn't match them at all. They're not very good at the egg phase on pasture. So what are some of the environmental conditions that are needed to activate those eggs to become larvae? So moisture level, as you can see in the bottom of this table, it's all about the same, 10, 15 mils of rain. They like moisture. All of the worm types like moisture in order to hatch. But the temperature, the daily maximum temperature, varies quite a lot. So the small brown stomach worm is around 8 degrees, and our black scale worm between 12 and 15 degrees, depending on the subspecies. But our Barber's pole worm, as I said at the beginning of the presentation, it's a warm environment. It likes its summer rainfall zone, and it likes the warm temperatures. So the brown stomach worm are much more tolerant of those cold, dry conditions. And therefore, the grazing management does tend to have less effect on them, which is why I said today there'll be a few more examples of the Barber's pole worm, because it's much easier to kill them on pasture. So the next section of the life cycle that's quite important before we move on to the actual mechanisms of grazing management a bit more practically is the time for eggs to become effective larvae under the right conditions. So it's about 4 to 10 days for the species. This means that we basically need really short graze periods. So a short graze period, so under 4 days here, to be on the safe side, will prevent auto-infection. So what is auto-infection? It's really important. So auto-infection is a term that's used throughout industry quite a bit, and it's really simply, it's the time it takes infected animals to be infected, by the larvae that are arising from the eggs that have been deposited by the same mob in the paddock. So that mob's deposited eggs in the paddock, they've hatched into larvae, and the same mob has eaten them and got infected again. And that's called auto-infection. So we want to prevent that from happening. So we want to stop the life cycle at that point. So as I've said, short graze periods are therefore really beneficial here, which is what helps determine the graze period. So our next point of call is the time larvae can actually survive on pasture. So we've worked now with what happens with the eggs and the environmental conditions that get the eggs to hatch and how long that they can last if they don't get the right environmental conditions. So they're points of the life cycle we can manipulate. But now let's move on to the larvae. How can we manipulate the larvae? Well, interestingly, once L3 are up and mobile and wriggling around, they're wriggling around in drops of moisture in the pasture, which you can see here from a wonderful photo that I absolutely love that's come from under a microscope from New Zealand. Now, these L3 are all sitting here in a drop of moisture, and that's how they move around the pasture. L3 themselves don't feed on anything. So I always think of them as they've got a little encasement, really simplistic terms, which is their feed supply. And that lasts them oh so long. Different parts of our climate, though, affect how long that will last them. Increased activity in warmer weather makes them die off quicker because they're using up their feeds and their reserves. In extreme hot, dry and windy conditions, the larvae will also desiccate and dry out and die. So this video I love because I often hear, especially living up in the tablelands where it's quite cold, how can Barber's poleworm and other worms survive the cold conditions? Surely they die off in the cold. Well, the larvae are extremely robust. And you can see on the left, they don't move very much under 5 degrees, but under 25 degrees, they're wriggling around and up the pasture and moving about. So they're using up the small amount of reserves that they have on board. And as a result, they die a lot quicker at 25 degrees and they can live a lot longer at 5 degrees. So a bit of a myth there busted, I think. And it's something that people often get confused about. And I know I certainly did when I started out in the sheep industry. So here's a little bit of a look at it, a bit more of a time zone for you of those larvae that are wriggling around on pasture. Exactly how long can they survive for? So this table looks at the time it takes for about 90% of Barber's poleworm infective larvae to die on a pasture. That would make a pasture fairly low risk if we could kill all the infective larvae on it so that none of it could be reconsumed by the animals. And all this data that I'm using today, I should state, can be found on the WormBoss website. So don't panic if you're missing it. You can look it up and all the tables and graphs and charts are there. So under really cold conditions, and we just saw that little larvae swimming around at 5 degrees. So at 15 degrees, our larvae are going to take up to 4 months to die on pasture. So we need a really long rest period. This is particularly important if we've got spring lambs. Because if we're trying to get a lambing paddock ready and we've got to do it over winter, we have to allow the extra time because the larvae aren't dying off. And if you keep going down the table, it goes 3 months to 22 degrees. 35 degrees is 1.5 months. But as you get up to that really very hot 35, 40 degrees, you're starting to look at, between 1 to 6 weeks. So summer is really our friend almost. And we think of the worm season as summer and that's a really bad season. But if you want to flip it on to being half glass is full, your larvae is actually dying off a lot quicker during this period, which means through pasture and grazing management, we can actually help to really lower the burdens that might be infecting our sheep. So that was Homungus or Barber's poleworm. So looking at the larvae of brown stomach worm and black scale worm, they can survive much longer on pasture than Barber's poleworm. And this is because they stay in the fecal pellet a lot longer, whereas the Barber's poleworm start to develop into 3rd stage larvae and they get straight onto the pasture and wriggle up it, move around and die off a lot quicker. So that's something that we need to look at when we're looking at grazing and pasture management for these species. So when I think about grazing management, I try not to get too overwhelmed with it because when I first started looking at grazing management, I did find it quite overwhelming. But I think, and I recommend to people that they start off with just looking after their most vulnerable stock, and it makes it a little bit easier. And it doesn't matter. There's certainly a gold standard to this recipe, and it's going to protect as much of your flock as possible as you can. But that can also, it's actually not practical in every situation. So I think it's really good to work through the susceptibility of your stock and look after the ones that are most susceptible first with your grazing management. So I like to start with our weaners or our young sheep, and they're most susceptible to worms because they haven't been exposed to worms before, or very few. So they haven't managed to build an immune response. So they have no natural immunity. So they're a little bit like a young human baby who goes off to childcare for the first time. They get exposed to everything and catch everything because they've got no immune system. But as you grow up, you get a better immune system towards common colds and things. So our young sheep need to be looked after. So preparing weaning paddocks, which we're about to look at, is really important. When they come off their mums, they need the cleanest pastures you have on the farm. So if that's all you can achieve, that is just wonderful. If you can clean up a paddock for your young sheep, that's great. The next group of animals we need to consider are our reproductive ewes. So when I think about reproductive ewes, it's not just lactating, it's when they're actually pregnant as well. And in scientific terms, we call it a periparturient relaxation of immunity. So they've had immunity all their life, but because they go and they're pregnant and then they're lactating, their body's using so much of its reserves for building these little lambs and then supporting them through the first few months of their life. And that's taking a lot of resources from our ewes, and they pull those resources away from their immune response. So they lose their immunity that they have acquired over their lives during their reproductive phase. So they need to be looked after as the next priority group. And you can do this by preparing them a lambing paddock, which they go on to about a week prior to lambing. So when they're at their most vulnerable, they're being exposed the least to worms. The next group of animals in your flock will be your rams. They certainly get susceptible at times when they're during high reproductive pressure as well. And then finally, you have your dry ewes and your wethers, which generally, they're pretty good. They're pretty robust when it comes to worms, and they hold off much better than our vulnerable stock. So they're probably least on your scale of priority if you've got a scarce resource when it comes to grazing management. So if we look at grazing management, we obviously have a few gold standards, and we have different situations and different ways that we can accomplish it. The first is, which I've just touched on, is preparing low-risk paddocks, and we do that for our weaners, our most vulnerable stock, and then next our periparturient ewes, so our pregnant and our lambing and our lactating ewes. And we prepare these low-risk paddocks for them because they're vulnerable. They're not able to mount their own immune response. So we need to look after them. We want them going into those paddocks worm-free, and we want those paddocks as worm-free as possible. The other way we can look at, we're going to go through most of these topics, we look at year-round rotational grazing. It's a bit of a gold standard. It's not necessarily viable in all regions, but there are some really good principles that we can get out of intensive rotational grazing that we can take on and apply to a more broader grazing situation. And then for the southern areas of Australia, we can look at smart grazing, and that is a really good way of preparing paddocks for our weaners down there that are under the influence of other worms that aren't Mother's poleworm. Regardless which option we want to look at and that will fit our production system, all of them rely on manipulating the worm's life cycle to our advantage. And that's why I spent a bit of time at the beginning of this presentation going through the different stages of the life cycle that are relevant. So for the people that hopped on a little bit late, here are my two sum up points of that life cycle. We want to aim to lower the number of larvae being ingested by our sheep, and we want to lower the number of eggs being deposited on the pasture. So preparing low-risk paddocks for our most vulnerable stock. This is ensuring that the paddocks that they have to go onto are as worm-free as possible for our young sheep and our periparturient ewes. It is a really important tool for control that potentially is being a little bit underutilized in industry. So it's a really easy way to gain and a hold on your parasite control. It does this as well by reducing our reliance on chemical drenches, which is really important for slowing down the development of resistance, chemical resistance that is, which we're all struggling with. And it aims to reduce the overall exposure of worms to the animals. So we do this by being proactive, not reactive. And it's a really hard thing to do because we're really busy as farmers, and it's really easy to be reactive. If we've got a problem, we address a problem. But in this case, to prepare low-risk paddocks, we have to be proactive. It involves prevention and a lot of forward planning. And based on some of that information that I gave you before about how long it takes for larvae to die off on pastures, it can take up to 6 months to clean the paddock, wean a paddock up and your paddock for your ewes up, depending on your location and climatic conditions. And depending on your mob sizes, you might need a couple of weaner paddocks as well. So we need to aim to expel paddocks from infected animals to allow the eggs and the larvae to die off. There are a number of ways we can do this, and some of them will work for your situation. Multiples might work for your situation and others won't. It's trying to find what will work for your production system. There's no silver bullet here. So containment areas are a really good option. And I think they definitely came more popular within the drought. And it rests your paddocks, and you might already be using containment areas and not realizing the benefit you're getting, and you could utilize those paddocks more. Certainly using crop stubbles and hay and silage is a great way of utilizing those paddocks while you're trying to keep sheep off. So preventing contamination from infected animals is really important. This doesn't mean we can afford to leave the paddock empty by any means. So there are a few different things we can do. If you're lucky enough to have cattle, even just trade cattle as part of your production system, you've really got a very valuable tool here. Grazing with cattle will help mop up extra pastures. They will mop up any larvae that might be on the pasture as well. And there's no cross-contamination because sheep parasites are effective in goats and sheep only. So cattle are a great tool here. You can also graze with sheep following an effective short-acting drench. And wethers are really useful here because they have a really good, strong natural immunity, which we spoke about. But I would use caution here that first, know what an effective short-acting drench is on your property. So by doing a fecal egg count reduction test, really work out what drenches are still working on your property and what level of resistance you have. So certainly you can put a short-acting drench in and then graze for a short period of time with those sheep. Grazing with sheep with a correctly used long-acting is definitely something that people utilise when they don't have any other options. So they can't keep sheep out of their paddock, are the two options, why these two options would be used. So using a long-acting but properly with a good primer and a tail cutter, and test with both of these. Do regular worm egg count testing and know if the animals that you have in those paddocks that you're trying to clean up are actually carrying parasites or not. So as I said before, crop, silage, hay, another great way of utilising those paddocks and keeping worms out. For those in Barber's poleworm areas, Barbavax is certainly a good tool to have in your toolbox here. It lowers the larval pasture contamination by keeping the sheep more worm-free. Biowormer has been shown to do a similar thing. And of course, longer term, and definitely can't be underestimated, is selecting rams who have a lower worm egg count, ASBV. So I can't take much credit for this one. This is has been put together by Matt Playford, which I've tweaked a little bit. And it's a really simple way of trying to work out and track what's going on your farm, no matter what your region. So even if you're out west, you're in a high rainfall area, you're down south in more of a Mediterranean climate, this is a really handy and simple and free way of keeping track of what's going on your paddock. So most of us have a farm map and we have our paddocks on it. So Matt calls this his red light, his traffic light system. So we have the red light, stop, don't graze. It's high contamination. It's been grazed with wormy stock and it's going to take about 6 months to clean up. Definitely do not put your weaners and your vulnerable ewes in here. So for example, this paddock might have just been grazed this season with pregnant ewes at foot and they're returning on test a high worm egg count. That paddock is going to be loaded with larvae. Don't put stock near it. Then we move on to the amber, which is moderate contamination. So you've started to prepare this paddock, but it still hasn't been prepared for long enough, so it's got still moderate pasture contamination. So for example, this paddock might have been grazed with sheep for a month after having an effective long-acting, and then you've put cattle in with 2 months. So it's really been without having wormy animals going onto it, adding to the larval contamination for 3 months. But remember, we're still waiting that 6-month period, depending on the climate, for the larvae that were already deposited back at the red light stage to start to die off. But I tell you what, it's still better than the red light stage. So if you get to a point in it's not the gold standard, but if you get to a season and a point in your production system that you've got to use one of the paddocks, use the amber paddock instead of the red light paddock, and it will still help you out. Then moving up the chain, of course, green is good to go. And they've got really low contamination. You've tried with all your tools in your toolbox, your hardest to get that paddock ready to graze at low contamination for your most vulnerable stock, your weaners and your periparturient ewes. So this paddock, for example, has been emptied from sheep for 6 months and it's been grazed with cattle. It might have been used for silage or hay or whatever other tools you tried to use. So I really like this traffic light system and I encourage people to adopt it. So in Southern Australia, we move on to scaleworms for a moment here during winter. It's just as important to ensure that the pregnant ewe lambs in paddocks are lambing down in paddocks again with really low larval pasture contamination. So it's important to ensure that all stock that have been grazing these paddocks beforehand have really low worm burdens. And the only way to know that is to confirm it with a worm egg count. And test, don't guess. We say it a lot here at ParaBoss, but it's so important to actually know and go to an accredited lab regularly and find out what your worm egg count is. If it is a cool, wet summer, your stock may need a second summer drench, and you can only know this if you're confirming it with a worm egg count. And you want to do that to make sure they don't get too high, so you're keeping your larval contamination low. So when preparing your lambing paddocks, again, I've just said it before, forward planning is definitely a must. You have to be proactive, not reactive. Egg development to the L3 stage is slower in the cooler conditions, and it can take up to 30 days to complete that life cycle. And that's really handy to know in those cooler conditions down south, because it means you have a longer graze period. You can graze up to 30 days far more safely while still trying to prepare those lambing paddocks. So you can leave animals on there with an effective drench for a little bit longer. So it's really important to know the species you're dealing with and the climatic conditions that it favours. So larval survival on pastures is quite good over winter down south as well. And this is what this graph here shows. It shows the contamination level and how it changes based on the different temperatures. So it takes up to 90 days for 75% of the larvae to die off. And this is again really important for working out the best grazing strategy to minimize the amount of larvae on pasture. So we've just said we can graze for about 30 days. We need to then start to think about a rest period of 90 days in order to make sure 75% of the larvae that were deposited on the pasture have died off. Smart grazing, which is on our ParaBoss website as well, is a way of preparing winter weaning paddocks down south in southern Australia. And it utilises the grazing period of 30 days after an effective summer drench. So there's no or very minimal eggs being deposited in this time, which helps keep the paddocks clean. It does, however, because of the extra pasture that's grown, and we're going to talk a little bit about this a little bit later in the presentation. Grazing management is always a balance between larvae and pasture utilisation. So you're going to grow a lot more food. So you're going to have to increase your grazing, your stocking rates here to make sure that you reduce the food on offer. So you want to utilise it. You certainly don't want to waste it. It also has the added bonus of removing the excess food, enhances your summer heatworm larval kill-off because it exposes them to the elements and dries and desiccates the larvae out. So drench your weaners is the take-home message here before putting them in your smart graze paddock, and there's more information on the website about that. So rotational grazing, I suppose we could call that your gold standard. It's really looking at year-round rotational grazing for all classes of animals. So it's not, you might still use it to prepare your weaner or lambing paddocks, but it's to protect all your animals all year round. And it's not necessarily viable in all production systems, but there are some really key elements to it which I think can be applied. So we're going to work through rotational grazing a bit here, and I'm hoping you can get some valuable information out of it. It really rests on understanding the graze and rest periods, and we've gone through them a little bit, but we're going to go into them in a bit more detail here. These two are both critical periods to grazing management, but I think of them under equal importance. So rotational grazing is year-round rotational grazing, which requires sections of the system to be free of sheep. But again, as with preparing your lambing and weaning paddocks, it doesn't mean they've got to stay unproductive. So don't leave your paddock empty. Think about the alternatives, which we've just mentioned. So you've got your different crops that you can put in, and your silage and haymaking, use of wethers and dry use with a short-acting or a long-acting drench. Definitely your cattle are your friend, using WEC ASBVs, biowormer and Barbavax as a few examples. So your graze period, we'll start with that. This is a fine balance between considering the amount of feed that you have available and that you want to utilise, and also the life cycle of the parasite species you're aiming to control. We need to consider that valuable auto-infection period that we spoke about before, which is the time it takes one mob to put eggs on pasture for those eggs to hatch, become L3 larvae and be re-ingested. So the graze period was 4 to 10 days, dependent on the species and the environmental conditions present. And you aim to graze stock shorter than that to prevent that auto-infection period we spoke about before. A short graze period, again, will prevent reinfection and lower exposure to parasites. And we need to consider the life cycle of the target parasite and the environmental conditions that we have at the time. The rest period, it's the time a paddock is rested from a single species of grazing livestock that we've been over. Sheep parasites, again, can only complete their life cycle in sheep and goats, so cattle are your friend. And the rest period breaks the life cycle of the parasite by breaking its ability to hatch onto pasture and allow larval die-off. But here becomes the challenging bit. It is an absolute balancing act. And I like these little scales. They're not quite true to scale, that's for sure. But choosing a period of grazing and rest is a balance between the worm contamination and pressure on the pasture and utilising what you've grown. There's no point growing a haystack that you never eat. Consider the pasture species that you have growing and the time of year, because different winter species and summer species will require different grazing management, as you'd know. The faster growing pasture species in summer will require naturally a shorter rest period between grazing events. This is really handy because remember, larvae will die off quicker too. So we require a shorter rest during the summer periods from a parasite point of view, but a pasture point of view as well. So it's kind of, it helps us out here. Pasture recovery is also quicker. And as I said, larval die-off is accelerated in those warmer months. So it matches up the same for the cooler time of the year. Our slower growing winter pastures in the cooler conditions require a longer rest period to recover from being grazed, and larval die-off is also slower. So we need a longer rest period during the winter months. So I'm just going to work through, and bear with me here because numbers can get a little bit crunchy on this, but I'm going to work through a little bit of a scenario for intensive rotational grazing, and no surprises, I'm going to do it in a summer rainfall zone with Barber's poleworm because this is where it is most effective against Barber's poleworm. So remember, we want to aim for the eggs and the larvae. So the eggs, the minimum time it takes eggs to become an L3 is 4 days. So our grace period, we want to be less than this. That's our ideal. Our larvae at approximately 25 degrees takes 60 days for 90% of the larvae to die. And we can see that on this graph here, which has come from the ParaBoss website. You can see that the arrow is pointing across to the 25-degree temperature line, which is sitting at days of survival, and only 10% of the larvae have survived. So 90% have died off, which is sort of what we're aiming for, to get them as clean as possible. So this means we want a rest period of 60 days. So here comes our balancing act. Will we have enough pasture to make this all work? So let's work. I've kept these calculations as simple as I could. We're going to work on a 24 cells per 24 cells at 1 hectares each. We have quite a high stocking rate in this because we want to eat as much of the pasture as possible because it's going to be rested, and so it's going to have a lot of regrowth. So pasture budgeting is important here. Knowing our stocking rate's important, knowing what our stock eat. So our stocking rate of 15 DSE is going to give us a stocking density of 24 hectares times by 15 DSE of 360 DSE per hectare. So if let's say 1 DSE will eat 1 kilogram of dry matter per day. And so our stocking density of 360 DSE will be equal to 360 kilos of dry matter per day. So if we have, say, 3,000 kilos of dry matter in our paddock, but we want to leave behind 1,500 kilos of dry matter. This is really important because after grazing, we don't want to graze it down too heavily if we don't have to. Again, this is the gold standard. We can't always get away with this, but we want to leave it so that we've got a quick amount of recovery. So if we've got leaf, we can grow more. So I'll just go back one slide. So we have 3,000, we want to leave 1,500, so we can have 1,500 to utilize. We want to graze for 4 days. We've already determined our graze period so that we don't have eggs hatching and our auto-infection coming through. If we graze 1 hectare cell for 4 days, at that 360 kilos of feed that we needed by 4 days, we're going to need 1,440 kilos of feed to get us through 4 days for that number of animals. So we can graze each of those paddocks for 4 days in 24 cells. And that gives us, if we calculate it out, a rest period of 96 days, which is plenty. It's plenty to allow our larval die-off. The problem we might get here, and we've done this based on pasture budgeting, the problem we might get here is we have too much feed in a really good season, and this is why cattle are really important to come in and help mop up, or you can put more stock on based on a pasture budget. So I don't know how I'm quite going on time here, but I have some take-home messages. And when I went back over this presentation, this is what I really wanted you to think about when leaving. And that is to really think about knowing the main parasites that you have and be mindful that that's ever changing at the moment. And I hear a lot of reports of that, you know, Barber's pole's on the move and Anecdotally, when some people get control of one parasite, the other one starts to cause them a bit more grief. So really think about knowing your parasites. How you know what parasites you have is by testing, do a worm egg count and a larval differential, and then get to know the parasites that you've got better. Know what conditions that support their survival and, importantly, their die-off, because this will help you know how to manage them. WormBoss can help. Remember, everything that came from here today is from the WormBoss website. Oh, and a few of my random calculations. Be proactive, not reactive. It's going to mean planning ahead. And really know and start to record your paddock history. It's easy to do. And think about using the traffic system. And test, don't guess. Worm egg counts, as always, are your friend here. So that's all from me for now, but I open it up for questions. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks, Fiona. It's certainly been a masterclass, I have to say. I find pasture management, whether you've got sheep, cattle, goats, the principles apply here very much so. And I find that it's an area that myself, but others do find a little bit complicated because not very exact. And I think what you've summed up today has been great, because you want to just be trying to take the little free kicks each time out of what you're doing. If you can elevate something, make something more effective, cost effective, lasts a bit longer, if you get a little bit more time, that's your friend. So thanks for a really informative presentation, Fiona. We've got a few questions coming in. I wrote down during the course of your presentation about how overwhelming you might find it, and there's so many unknowns, and there's so many how long's a piece of string in this space. I find it really difficult to give some definitive answers, but there's some excellent questions in here which are fabulous questions. So I'll start off with them. That Mandy was wondering, is it possible to eradicate worms from a property by feedlotting, and how long might that take?
Oh,
sorry to start you off with a hard one.
Great question, Mandy. I don't know. I would say no. I do not think it's possible to eradicate worms from your property. Certainly, feedlotting is an excellent option because larvae have to survive on pastures. So in theory, if there's no pasture, that should work really well as well. But I suppose if they're feedlotted 100% of the time, there isn't even a blade of grass next to a water trough, they can't poke their head through the fence line to the green pasture that's just outside of your feedlotting system, that one doesn't escape. There are so many variables there. And as a guide, my husband's family bought a property that hadn't been grazed by sheep for well on 50 years, was cattle only, and all the fences were ripped out and an intensive rotational grazing system put straight in with animals that had very good WEC ASBVs and were 4-way quarantine drenched with 2 actives straight across to that property and put straight into a 4-day graze and a 90-day rest. And worms still started to build up and appear. They were very well controlled, but they still managed to appear. So I don't think we'll ever eradicate them.
No, I think people scratch their heads after the prolonged droughts and think, no self-respecting worm's going to be surviving. But, somehow they manage to either be in the sheep or, in the soil, hiding somewhere on a blade of grass or right close to the surface of the soil. So it's certainly it's a good question. Certainly there's some obviously some inroads that can be made there. So Linton's got a question here about tillage and the role of tillage for sown crops, and does that reduce contamination quicker?
Definitely. By manipulating the soil in any way is exposing anything that's in the soil and breaking up any fecal pats as well after they've been grazed. So yes, it is definitely a very useful tool having in the toolbox to help manage that.
Thanks, Fee. Harry's got a question here. How long can the different types of worms survive in the sheep's stomach if grazing clean pastures, i.e., not grazed by sheep for a year or more?
They can, let me just go back to our slide and I'll just stop screen sharing here. I think it is about a month. I don't think they survive much longer than that. Can you just repeat that whole question for me, Megan?
Yeah. So how long can the different types of worms survive in the stomach if grazing clean pastures, i.e., a brand new that hasn't been grazed with sheep for a year or more?
So infected
a bit like the scenario you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, so infective larvae that are already in the adults can live for many months. I'm not quite sure exactly how many within the sheep's gut, reproducing and continuing to lay eggs.
And certainly in some cattle, they can become inhibited larvae as well, can't they, Fiona?
True.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's not a definitive answer for that one today. John was wondering if people have tested the benefit of breeding sheep for parasite resistance. And I think the New England's the mecca of that, isn't it?
Absolutely, John. It's certainly something I always try and think about, and it's back to that first question from Mandy too. We're never going to get rid of parasites, I don't believe. And I think of managing parasites as having a really big and the analogy of it is a really big toolbox. And the more tools that you have in your toolbox, the better you are in your fight to deal with parasites on your farm. And selecting rams that have an ASBV for WEC, certainly you can make traction, very good traction within 10 years. And we've seen that on our own farm, that we have really good natural resistance within our animals from selecting rams with ASBVs for WEC.
Daniel's question, what effect does topping, now I'm not sure whether he means pasture topping or slashing, like cutting, but what effect does topping a paddock have on eggs and L3s?
Let's say you mean cutting or slashing the pasture. So anything that would expose the larvae, for example, to hotter and drier conditions would accelerate their death. So, and it was one of the slides I cut out of the presentation to try and make it shorter, so we weren't here all evening. And it was a profile of the grass, and most of the larvae live close to the soil surface, and they move around in the bottom 5 centimetres of the pasture. So those bigger pasture swards, you wouldn't be exposing without slashing. So that isn't a great way of doing it. Or cattle do a great job too, because they'll get in and muck around with the pasture as well and expose those larvae to higher death rates.
So similarly, if your cattle aren't grazing all the way down, they're naturally going to be, ingesting less numbers of the larvae, because the vast majority of them are living in the first 5 to 10 centimetres of pasture height, aren't they?
Yes.
Yep. Peter's got one here. Sorry if I missed this, but did the barber's pole survive get spread by cattle? It's a good question.
Yeah, it is a great question. There is a type of Barber's poleworm in cattle that you may have heard from, which does create a bit of confusion, but the Haemonchus contortus that affects sheep does not cross-contaminate with cattle. So they're a really useful way of helping clean up pastures.
Richard's got a question with regards to how would you recommend to manage Barber's poleworm in irrigated ryegrass clover pastures being grazed every 20 to 30 days over summer? It's a good question. Quite similar. I would expect that there'd be some similarities with like an area such as the New England, but yeah, certainly.
So if they're stocked over those pastures, or are they are they grazed for a short period and then rested for 20 to 30 days over summer? So I'll answer it in two ways. If they're set stocked on irrigated ryegrass, I've seen a property out in Western New South Wales, and my recommendation was that he got out of sheep. Simply, it was a Barber's poleworm farm. So if you've got irrigated pastures that you're grazing constantly, which they were at this property, you're just going to breed a whole heap of worms, and you're not going to struggle keeping your drenches alive. But if you're grazing and then you've got the ability to rest for 30 days over summer, you almost might be starting to break the life cycle at that time, because if you, and you might have missed the section of the presentation, but it has been recorded, there was a video of larvae at 25 degrees and they move a lot. So over summer with high moistures, hatching would be very quick, and activity of the larvae would be very quick, and therefore larvae die-off would be very quick. So over summer, you don't need to rest for as long. So there might be ways of tweaking that production system in order to break the life cycle.
So just follow, yeah, it does. And following on from that, so there might be an opportunity, depending on how many actual paddocks and pastures that you have there, to utilize some electric fencing to even sort of increase the number of paddocks, which would just give you some extra hectares in that system, or altering your stocking rates as well to give you just a greater bit of flexibility to break that life cycle.
Yes, which would be, especially if it was some sort of a finishing system, that would be very necessary to try and break the cycle, because you would be stuck with the drenches that you could use with withholding periods, which I'd be mindful of.
It's such a moving piece.
Such a fine
balance. So many bits and pieces. But I guess, the one thing that, we hope that everybody takes from today is that, there will be something that you can take and apply to your own operation, which will give you some benefit. Emily's got a question. Do we know if worm eggs survive in kangaroos?
Look, I think the jury's still out on that. I've heard yes, and I've heard no. I've heard no more than I've heard yes.
Do I need to drench? Peter's got one. Do I need to drench my cattle as regularly as sheep if they're in the same rotation?
Not knowing what your system is, in general, cattle do not need to be drenched as much as sheep. They can be given a worm egg count to find out if you're not sure. But if there's nothing, if you're happy with the way the cattle are working, there's no need to drench the cattle on behalf of the sheep, because there's no crossover of species, but worm species between the two. So you can treat your cattle very much as a cattle enterprise and your sheep as a sheep enterprise.
The worms. The questions are still coming in thick and fast, Fiona. So I'll keep going until you look like you're, you can't answer anymore.
It would be good if we could save the questions, Megan, just as a thought, because if we don't get to them all, since it's obviously a very popular topic, it might be something that we could sit down with later, and we could do a Q&A and send it out as a document. Might make a nice published document.
How do we save them? Do you know?
That's
above my technical Zoom prowess.
Yeah,
we'll keep going. Yep, there's some more here. So, actually, it comes through in the reports. Yep. How could we determine, Maria wants to know how we could determine the survival rate of the L3 in the pasture of a particular area? I think that's probably relating to where we could get some of those graphs, and we could use some of that into.
Great question. All those graphs that I showed are on the WormBoss website. So if you Google WormBoss or ParaBoss, and you can choose your sheep, you can choose your area, and you can even choose the season, and it will give you information. And if you have any problems finding those graphs or interpreting those graphs, please give me an email.
Christine's got one here. Is harrowing beneficial? I think we'll put that in with some cultivation. So again, light air
disturbs the soil, and any pats or dung pats or anything that are there certainly will disrupt the life cycle.
It's got one here about is there any has there been any research done on which different pasture species, whether some might be better hosts for worm eggs and larvae, i.e., different pasture species sort of being a better environment?
Oh, not that I know of, but I'm happy to stand corrected. That's a good Matt Playford question because he goes to bed reading scientific journals, whereas I tend to read a novel. Hope he's online. He'll laugh at that. But I would have thought rather than the actual species, I know there are some species that contain different chemicals, for want of a better word at the moment, that help with the animal's ability to withstand parasites, but that is a slightly different twist. It is more to do for me with the height of the pasture sward and how much protection you're giving the larvae. So you're creating more dewdrops and storing more moisture at the base of the sward to help keep the L3 larvae alive.
In our area, though, also pasture density is quite important. So, in some of the more sort of, dry rainfall mixed farming areas, for example, Lucerne, there'll be a lot of air in between, and quite a lot of ground in between plants as well. So the pasture density can sort of be used to one's advantage in that area as well.
Yeah, sorry, I took that slide out. It's come up a little bit.
Yeah. Vic's got a question here. Are goats less susceptible to worms compared to sheep as they're browsers, not grazers? If so, would you have more grace period to rotate pastures?
It would depend on your production system. I feel that goats are more susceptible. That's just in my experience. But I think that would be predominantly because we aren't grazing necessarily goats as browsers in certain parts of Australia. Certainly out west they are, where there's a lot less parasite pressure and they're acting as browsers. But when you bring them more into the higher rainfall zones, we're putting goats onto pastures and they've got access to pastures, so they're browsing less by default because they've got lovely ryegrass and clover and all sorts of lovely natives underneath them as well, rather than having to hop up and eat a tree. So yes, in theory, they should have less exposure, but because of the climates that we're putting them in, I would say potentially no. Sorry, that was a bit of a make a good politician on that answer.
I guess one of the things, I know that we've talked about this before when we've been talking about, like Matt's done a couple of more organic type management of worms in goats and the next level healthy goats, talking about the role of browse and even just having a period of time like that can help with sort of busting that life cycle. Sue said he loved the traffic light system. Is there an app to help with this type of planning?
I'll suggest that one to Matt Playford. He's always pushing me to develop apps for him. So, oh my goodness, he doesn't need any help. But no, not at the moment. But look, at home, I get a nice big printout from your local print shop of your property map and make sure all your paddocks are drawn on it. So it can be an aerial shot just off Google, draw your maps on it, and then get a big piece of plastic and pin it up on a board and cover it in plastic, and you can write all over it with a whiteboard marker and then take it off and do all the planning you want to do with different textures, and it's interchangeable. So you can move things straight from red into amber with a different texture color if you want, if that's the way that floats your boat, because I would like that. I love texture markers and playing with colors and paper and things. So it all depends how your system would work for you, but that is a really easy fix, is just to get a printout and a piece of plastic and pop it up.
I find that this topic's one of those ones where I always want to draw myself a diagram and I want it written down. It's hard to visualize how you might do that on your own place, and I think that's a really good suggestion to utilize a farm map. And even if you've got a map on one of those magnetic whiteboards with the little magnets on there as well. There's plenty of ways to do that there.
It depends if you're a visual learner or not, but I'm definitely a visual person. I like it all played out in front of me.
Yeah, me too. Got a couple here with regards to slashing, mulching, harrowing. And so I just want to come back onto that. Even if opening up dung pats, for example, like cow pats, that's not actually getting everybody, like all of the worms going, like that's going to improve by by the role of desiccation, correct?
Yeah, it sort of breaks it down to whether it's an egg or whether it's larvae. So we went down to the way the different species of eggs can survive and the time that they can survive before getting the right environmental conditions to hatch. And then once they've hatched into larvae, then that becomes a little bit different again. So the larvae of Barber's poleworm get a little bit more active and head out, whereas black scale and small stomach can stay in the dung pat for a little bit longer and protect themselves a little bit more. So that's where it really helps, which is why I put it in my take-home messages, that comes down to knowing your species, but then once you know them, get to know them better, and then sit down and go back through what supports their life cycle and stages. And the recording of this will be back out, but all the information's on the WormBoss website as well. And, find out how many days that your parasites will survive for under certain environmental conditions.
Still got a couple more questions, but we're nearing the back end of them. John's just asked about dung beetles. Has there been work done with the role of dung beetles? We've certainly had a webinar on that one, but Fee, I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, look, we did, John. And I would say for sheep, no. I'd say for cattle, yes, more potential was what came out of that webinar. I'm trying to think back, and it was a great webinar. We had 2 great presenters online for it. But certainly dung beetles aren't as active, was my recall of that in sheep pellets. So not so much of a benefit there, certainly, but for cattle, yes, there was more benefit, mainly through, I think the research was exposing the dung pat and opening it up.
If the ewes have a low worm egg count before lambing, would you still give a pre-lambing drench? It's a great question. Get asked that a lot.
Yeah, look, we do get asked that a lot, and it is a really good question. I would always be very cautious with how I would answer that. Industry standard is it is the only drench that you probably don't even need to do a worm egg count for, and that you just drench. Because look, there's a lot of reasons for that. If you got a really low worm egg count and you had a lot of tools in your toolbox, so you did excellent grazing management and you had really good resistance and you were giving really good protein supplementation, so they're on a good nutrition, they've got good condition score, and there's a whole heap of things going in their favour, they may make it, okay? But they also may not, and then you're stuck with really wormy ewes with lambs at foot that you've got to muster back into a yard and drench. And I would say you're going to create more problems than it would have been worth just giving that drench. So it is really the one drench that I would recommend giving without question.
And really importantly, I guess we've seen with some of those worm egg counts where you've got, a real mixture of counts. Make sure that you are scanning and separating your singles, twins, and dries, because your dries are going to be the ones that turn up with no worm egg count, or lower worm egg counts. Your twins are going to have the inherently higher ones, and obviously your singles are going to have.
And depending on when that worm test was taken, you could be just about to start a huge periparturient rise in worm egg count that you don't know about. So you might have taken it and thought this is great, and those ewes are just about ready to crash.
Yeah, exactly. So if you've got them in 6 weeks before or 7 weeks before lambing to do their pre-lambing animal husbandry, there's a long time between
that and
when you do that worm egg count as well.
Yeah.
Richard just came back to us with the rotationally grazed 5 to 10 days in, 20 to 30 days out. So I think your answer would still stand.
Yeah, definitely. I would recommend, Richard, relooking at those graphs. And so you've got a little bit further into rotationally grazing. So you need to, and you're right on the cusp there of whether you've got enough of a rest period or not. And it would depend on what rainfall you're under irrigation, so you know your rainfall, but it would depend on the temperature. So you can actually really quite accurately work out what's hatching, what's developing into larvae, what the die-off is, and exactly how long your graze and rest periods need to be to keep you safe. And then I'd err on caution and see if you can't add a day and reduce a day. So maybe reduce a day of the graze and then add a couple of days to your rest. But yeah, sit down. That's what I would be doing. I'd be sitting down quietly with the graphs and working out what gets you to 90% die-off. And you're probably pretty close depending on your temperatures.
Excellent. Again, you've got to draw the diagrams, haven't you? I know I do. Leah's got a couple here. Her question is, if using cattle with sheep to control parasites with rotational grazing, when do you graze the cattle? When do you graze the sheep? Do they follow each other? E.g. cattle 4 days maximum, sheep to follow and clean up? Or, how's the other way?
Look,
someone's getting around there.
Yeah, there's lots of different ways to do it, and there was a lot to that question. We do it a 30-60. So, and it would also depend on what class of stock you're talking about. So, if you had something with a higher nutritional requirement, I'd be putting them through first, followed up. So say it was pregnant ewes first, followed up by cattle. I'd potentially reverse that if the pastures were too long. So there's a lot of things going on there. If the pastures were too long for weaner sheep, or if there were lambs at foot, I would be putting cattle through first and then leaving them for halfway through the system, halfway through the rest time, and putting the sheep back through. My best advice for that one, which we would use at home, would be pasture budgeting is your best friend there. So get out, measure the pasture, work out what you've got, work out how much good green digestible matter you've got as well, and then do some really quick basic calculations like we just did on that screen on how much they're going to eat, how many you have, how big the paddock is, and work out how much you want to take out before the next group comes through, and how much your pasture will regrow as well, which we didn't talk about today, but that is sort of something that you factor in during the growing season, is how much it's going to regrow as well. But I wouldn't put them in on top of each other. I would have a gap.
We're just about at the end of our questions. We've got one more from Emily. Previous information for WA led us to believe that worm eggs harden senesce over summer and then hatch later in autumn and winter. Is that still the case? Is that still accurate science?
Sorry, no idea. That's a Brown Bezier question.
Just thinking the same thing. Emily, we'll take that on notice and ask Brown, get back to you.
Yeah, sorry, Emily.
Pete's just said, thanks for the session, very informative.
Thanks,
I think that's about it. Oh, Leah was just wondering about the use of like either chickens, like in a mixed grazing situation, or obviously birds. Do they have an effect in cleaning up, when they're ferreting through dung pats and the like?
Look, don't know, to be honest. If I had to hazard a guess at it, I would say not overly effective, because, they're going to move stuff around. And I actually did think about doing rotational chickens behind the sheep and cows at home, and I got a weird look from my husband when I suggested that, but I probably pushed it a bit far. Yeah, look, I'm not sure. I think it would add a lot of value to the system from a whole heap of other points of view. So, but I'm not quite sure from a parasite point of view whether it would be overly beneficial myself. Last
but not least, and then I think we better draw a line, otherwise we could be here until 5 o'clock this afternoon. And
we should have done a series of grazing management webinars. I'll pop a note in.
Yeah. Oh, look, we do love a good webinar. We love a good Q&A session as well. John was just wondering about the role of tannin in grazing pastures and
thanks,
shrubs.
John. That was the question. That was the Look, I don't know where the current research is at the moment. I'm a bit behind on that section of industry. Certainly there has been some excellent research run, and how economically viable they've got that now and palatable that they've got that species, I'm not sure. There is someone I was chasing in DPI to give us a webinar on that a little while back. So I shall pop that on my note of something that might be rather interesting to pop on the next webinar series, because I'm sure there has been some developments in the research. And I know that one of the big standing problems with that was that they weren't overly palatable when you put them in a sward of other pastures.
Excellent. Faye, I'm going to finish on a high. Sue's just said,
Thank you.
thank you, extremely informative. I'm off to the printers and we'll back it up with a spreadsheet. And I think, you know, if that's something that people take away from today, you know, it'll be time well spent. There's a lot in this topic, and you've done a fabulous job of articulating how much is in here, but trying to simplify it for people so that it's not too much. My advice, it would be to take your advice and find some small chunks, start small. Don't try and change the world in the first 5 minutes. Have you got any other pearls of wisdom that you want to add to that?
No,
Faye?
and look, I said to Megan before, I hate analogies because I've just come off a webinar with Tim Gold this week, and he's a man of analogies, if anyone knows him. But I did say to Megan, when I think about it, I think of it as a running race, and the gold standard, the intensive rotational grazer, might cross first. But the person that stood at the line and never started to do anything, they're never going to make any headway. So even if you ran last in the race because you only did one tiny thing, you're still further than you were if you didn't come off the block to start with. So, and you can build off it every year. And the better you get, the more you try, the better you get. And oh my goodness, we're nearly 20 odd years in and we're still learning. Like, there's always more to learn, because right when you think you've got it right, the season throws you another curveball, but you're still better off doing it than not trying.
Faye, thanks for a masterclass. It's been great. I've had a
Thanks,
great
everyone.
time. It's been a big webinar. Thanks everybody for joining.